Well, good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of Columbia University Justice Lab, I'd like to welcome you all to what I think is going to be a very important discussion of one of the most challenging public policy problems that we're facing in criminal justice right now. And that's how do we respond to the problem of violence. My name is Bruce Weston, and I'm a professor of sociology and co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab. I want to begin by acknowledging the William T. Grant Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge, who supported the research that we're going to be hearing about today. In this panel, we'll be talking about the problem of violence through the perspective of two new papers that are being released today. The first paper comes from the emerging adult justice learning community, and it's called Thinking About Emerging Adults and Violent Crime. And the second paper is from the Square One Project's executive session on the future of justice policy, and it's called Reconsidering the Violent Offender. Now, both papers dig deep into what we know from rigorous research about the social problem of violence and the people who perpetrate it. The topic of violence is important because violent crimes and offences that have been classified as violent have been treated more and more harshly over the years at all stages of the criminal justice process. Perhaps the most striking example are so-called truth in sentencing laws that require a person convicted of a violent crime to serve 85% of their sentence. Truth in sentencing proliferated around the country throughout the 1990s, and time served for violent crimes increased and incarceration rates climbed to historically high levels. Of these long terms of incarceration made us safer. As we'll see this afternoon, people typically age out of violence by their early 20s. Those who are involved in crime do not really specialise, so the term violent offender is a misnomer. It doesn't really designate a specific category of people in the population. Also, people who have hurt other people often have serious histories of victimisation themselves, and as a result, we're reserving our toughest punishment for the victims of crime. The research suggests we need to fundamentally re-examine how we respond to violence. Long sentences, parole denials, pre-trial incarceration may not be buying us greater public safety. What's more, we should confront the ethics of punishing harshly people who themselves have been seriously hurt by others. If we are to care about the victims of crime in a deep way, I believe that histories of victimisation should open the door to compassion and mercy. These are undoubtedly challenging questions for public policy. The response to violence has been a stumbling block for criminal justice reform. Policymakers will readily extend leniency to so-called non-violent offenders, but going to square one on justice reform, reimagining a different kind of justice, involves re-examining how we respond to violence. And we have to use our best research and tap into our most compassionate values. We've got an incredible panel to discuss these issues today. And I now have the great pleasure in handing off to my good friend and colleague, Vinny Schiraldi. Vinny is my co-director at the Justice Lab. He's a senior research scientist at the Columbia School of Social Work and a former commissioner of New York City Probation. So thanks very much, Vinny.
I'd like to kind of quickly hang on and give Bruce, if you could just stay standing for a second and try not to drop any more stuff. Let's give a round of applause to Bruce, who just won the Outstanding Book Award from the Inequality, Poverty, and Mobility section of the American Sociological Association for Homeward, which is really a terrific book and a well-deserved honor. So everybody, I just want to point out that we are being live streamed, so kind of keep it clean, everybody in the audience there. I think it's, what's interesting right at this moment is that we have these two parallel processes going on at the Justice Lab. One of them is emerging adult learning community that WT Grant has assisted us with funding on, and that is very focused on 18 to 25-year-olds, young people that are just too old to be in the juvenile system as a special population worthy of attention. And then we have the Square One project that's really kind of trying to examine justice from a very elemental level, and rather than trying to sort of grapple with mass incarceration and the justice system, and rather than trying to fix that from where it stands and incrementally chipping away at it, is kind of taking it from the other end and saying, imagine we didn't have this system as we currently know it, and we were just building it from square one, what would we envision? And both of these processes in kind of separate, there's some overlap, me and Bruce, but really basically the rest of it is all separate people, came to the conclusion that we needed to write about, examine, discuss, and probe violence as an issue as we grapple with the two separate questions that we're trying to grapple with. And today's event and today's papers are the result of that. And so it's a terrific thing really for both of those. On behalf of the Emerging Adult Justice Project, I want to also say excited that today's a great day in terms of us launching our new website. The Emerging Adult group had said we really need to kind of collect up the data on this population and the research and the policies and the practices that are going on around the country, and so that people can kind of learn from the mistakes other people are making and some of the research that's out there. And that's launching today. It's at eajustice.org. And if you want to learn more about the Square One project, it's squareonejustice.org. And then the Justice Lab is at justicelab.columbia.edu. So we're pleased to be joined by one author from each of the papers to serve as panelists, as well as two discussants. Jim Austin's the co-author of Reconsidering the Violent Offender with Bruce and me. He's president of JFA Institute, where he conducts theoretical and applied research on the causes and responses to crime. He served as the director of several large U.S. Department of Justice-funded research and evaluation programs. Bianca Bersani is co-author with Bruce and John Laub of Thinking About Emerging Adults and Violent Crime. She's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, until tomorrow, at which point she becomes an associate professor at University of Maryland. Former W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow of the National Institute of Justice, and has worked with the Pew Research Center and other general media outlets to translate her research and increase accessibility to wider audiences. After Jim and Bianca present, we're going to be hearing from Liz Glazer and Frankie Guzman. Liz is director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, serves as the senior criminal justice policy advisor to the mayor, and oversees citywide criminal justice policy, develops and implements strategies across city agencies, and partners to enhance public safety, reduce unnecessary incarceration, and increase fairness. And Frankie Guzman's the director of the California Youth Justice Initiative at the National Center for Youth Law, where he works to eliminate the practice of prosecuting and incarcerating children in California's adult criminal justice system. He's helped lead the effort to promote alternative sentencing and local treatment for youth charged with serious offenses in California, and has helped to pass recent landmark legislation in California on youth offender parole hearings and juvenile fitness hearings. And those include some of the rare, specific pieces of legislation that affect emerging adults. There's not a lot of legislation in that area, but California's been on a leading edge of that. And so that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and I'm going to sit and watch like the rest of you.
Thank you, Vinny. I've been given a very difficult task I've never done before in my life, which is summarize a paper in 4 minutes. So all of you have watches, so raise your hand when I get to the 4-minute level, because I have to be done. I think the reason why I got involved in this paper is because a lot of the work that I do has to do with trying to lower prison and jail populations. And probably the number one factor that's propping these systems up now is how we detain and sentence people that we call violent offenders. So if you get anything else out of this presentation is the recognition that we have to do something about the way we do this if we want to have any hope of what people call lowering mass incarceration. Violent offender really is a clinical term, right? But the criminal justice system does not use it in that manner. People are called violent offenders who are not violent, have never killed anyone, have never hurt anyone. On the other side, there are people that have done horrendous things. So the violent offender tag, it applies to people like Sandra Bland, who was driving and got pulled over and kicked an officer during the confrontation, and she was jailed for assaulting an officer. That's a violent offender. You go to jail for that. You probably won't get bail set. No bail probably on that. Or you won't find a judge that'll be interested in releasing you. On the other hand, you have Thomas Silverstein, one of the most notorious prisoners in the Bureau of Prisons, just died recently, in for murder and killed 2 guards while handcuffed. He got out of the handcuffs and killed 2 guards. So we have these extreme, and plus I forgot the National Hockey League. That kind of fits in there also as a violent group. So one of the things that we are trying to nurse in the paper is how this label is used very loosely. And once you get that label applied to you, there are severe consequences. It begins with the arrest process and getting charged with a violent crime, which affects the bail amount, makes it harder for you to get out pre-trial. And then once you get sentenced, if you get sentenced as a violent offender, then you get a longer sentence. But on top of that, other things start happening. You don't get access to certain good time credits that other inmates can get. Parole guidelines are set to extend the time that inmates must serve before they can see the parole board. Once you get released, you'll be put at a higher level of supervision initially because of a risk instrument that says we need to put violent offenders at a higher risk level. So these are kind of the things that have to be broken down and removed because it's all reducing in greater lengths of stay, greater use of detention, and greater lengths of stay in the prison, parole, probation systems. Some of the research in the paper I want to note, we did a couple original research, which is done by Bruce and myself. We looked at people who were going through either the Arkansas or the Massachusetts prison systems. In my work, I found that about 40% of the people who were going through that system had seen someone murdered. And about half of those had seen someone murdered as a teenager. I've never seen anyone murdered. I haven't come close to seeing that. But that is a traumatic experience. A good portion of those people went on later to commit violent crimes themselves. So we have to recognize that some of these people that we call violent offenders have been severely victimized themselves and are traumatized about that experience. And we need to do something to intervene in their lives that'll help, take away some of that trauma. Bruce's research was the same thing. High percentages of people released from the Massachusetts prison system had been involved in fistfights, assaults, those kinds of violent activities. So we have to keep that in mind that these people that we call violent offenders are not getting up every day and committing violent crimes. I think Bianca's research, which she will talk about, shows it's a fairly rare event in their lives. And it doesn't last very long. But we continue to give them this mark of Cain. We have 3 major recommendations at the end of the report, and I'll just touch on these because we'll have some time to talk about them later. The number 1 recommendation, the first recommendation I should say, is to eliminate the use of the violent offender label in risk instruments and policies in the correctional system and the criminal justice system. So basically, we are recommending that we don't further punish people beyond getting a longer sentence than what they're getting now, they should have the same rights to be released pre-trial as long as they're not a risk of flight or a danger to the public. Right now, that's not the case. So we want the use of that label removed from that decision-making process at all points of the criminal justice and correctional system. In terms of the prison system, we have to reduce the length of stay for people that are, well, convicted of violent crimes, but also just prisoners in general, but in particular, the violent offender, because they're the ones that are really stacking up in the prison systems now. You can see this in the data. About half of the state prison system now is composed of people who've been convicted of a violent crime, whereas they only represent about 20% of the admission flow. So it's that stacking effect that is causing them to stay longer. There are ways to do this. There are ways to do this that we have done historically. So we're not recommending that anything be done different here, just to go back to the way we used to do our business. And then finally, we have to recognize that violence is a horrible event to the victim. It traumatizes people. It traumatizes communities. There are communities that have extremely unacceptable high rates of violence, where people are seeing violence too often and experiencing it. So we need to reinvest our resources into those communities and into those people, recognizing that they too are part of the solution. Thank you.
Hi, and good afternoon. Before I begin, I just want to thank and recognize again the co-authors of this report, John Lobb, unfortunately couldn't be here, and Bruce Western. Their long histories of research in the area really provided an important scaffolding to what became the brief. So roughly 2 years ago, conversations arose among colleagues in the emerging adult justice learning community regarding questions like, what does violence look like? Who engages in acts of violence? And are these individuals somehow different from those who don't engage in acts of violence? And how might these questions play out among emerging adults specifically? So what you have in front of you is really the product of those conversations and a response to these questions and many others. The emphasis on emerging adulthood is purposeful. These individuals, aged roughly 18 to 25 years old, experience not only the highest rates of violent offending, but also the highest rates of violent victimization, and are therefore disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. Importantly, this brief summarizes an extensive body of longitudinal research on violent criminal behavior over the life course, which utilizes and draws upon a wide range of data from criminal justice records as well as self-reports of offending and victimization. Given the time, I'm just going to highlight a couple of the key commonalities that we find in this work and that we share with you, and I hope and encourage you all to read the brief to get more details. So something that's already been brought up, one consistent theme that we find in the research is that there's really a lack of evidence of a violent crime specialist. Instead, persistent engagement in violent crime is rare. Violence is instead constitutes a small subset of behaviors that characterize an individual's involvement in crime. Second, whereas emerging adulthood constitutes a period of life course where exposure to violence, either as a perpetrator or victim, is the greatest, we also know that involvement in violence declines rapidly with age. And there's much evidence to suggest that the decline is most acute during emerging adulthood. In fact, desistance, or the process of moving away from offending, and violent crime in particular, is normal, pervasive, and occurs really early in the life course. Additionally, there's an extensive body of research that reveals a distinct overlap between individuals who are victims of violence and those who are perpetrators of violent crime. This phenomenon is known among criminologists as the victim-offender overlap. And in short, it suggests that we can't neatly categorize individuals as victims or offenders. Instead, beginning very early in the life course, individuals are exposed to violence in varied ways, suggesting that efforts to understand violent offending can't be separated from experiences with violent crime. And finally, we find that and know that the distribution of violence is not random, but is instead systematically concentrated and manifests in conditions of extreme poverty and structural disadvantage. Though research reveals that individuals who engage in violent acts are rare, situations conducive to violence are much more common. As a result, individuals exposed to violent places simply encounter more opportunities for violent interactions, either as perpetrator, offender, or witness. So reflecting upon this extensive body of work, we argue compels a reorientation of thinking about violence, recognizing the diversity of harm to individuals, families, and communities, but also challenges the idea that people who commit violent crime are fundamentally different and not worthy of consideration in conversations about criminal justice reform. And in the brief, we highlight a few pathways that we see as promising for responding to violence, and hopefully there'll be more time to highlight some of these in more detail, but they revolve around developing and strengthening social bonds to family and community, recognizing the duality of positions that individuals exposed to violence hold as victims and offenders, and also investing in and supporting local level community efforts to reclaim violent-prone areas and to create safe environments. So, that's it.
Now we're going to ask Frankie and Liz for comments, and you can stay there or come up here, whatever you prefer.
What do you prefer, Rena?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, just reflections?
Yes.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you, Vinny. You know, I really enjoyed reading these papers because I think that they do add a lot more to the conversation and thinking about where violence comes from. And I think it does a good job explaining violence in the context of environment and more appropriately placing an understanding of the root causes, both not only in environment, but also in the context of trauma. You know, we know that, you know, environment and context is important, you know, especially as we, you know, I think a lot of people understand violence as occurring in low-income communities, oftentimes discussed as low-income communities of color, and in the context of social inequity. And I know that the first paper on rethinking was the emerging adults and violent crime talks about the war on crime and the war on drugs, as well as the issues of trauma, people experiencing and witnessing violence, and oftentimes being one and the same. You know, but I would also like to raise that we need to be careful not to assume that poor communities of color are necessarily violent, or that to whatever extent that poor white communities and poor black and brown communities experience differences in violence, that it has something to do with the people or the culture. Because I think that one thing that wasn't really discussed in detail in either of the papers was, one, violence as a racialized, or violent offender as a racialized term. I think that violence occurs in white communities, but because of policing practices, oftentimes the arrest doesn't occur, and if it does, the charging doesn't occur, and if that does, the sentencing doesn't occur, and if that happens, the prison environment oftentimes looks different. And so a bunch of things will happen that will yield very different outcomes. And ultimately, upon reentry, the people that got, I would say, a more healthy version of the justice return to communities maybe in less of a harmed form. And what I mean to say is people that are treated violently by the system will come back as maybe more violent. And that leads me to the next issue that I don't think was really spoken to, which was the two forms of justice. You know, there's a justice system for white people, and there's a justice system for all other people. And I think when we talk about violence, violent communities, violent offenders, we need to talk about the disparate treatment that also contributes to the perception of violence, but also the manifestation of violence, which leads me to the third point that I think was also not highlighted, which is state-sponsored violence. I think that policing is violent. You know, we talk about stop and frisk, you know, stopping and frisking children, or shooting unarmed people in the street. The carceral settings are violent. You know, and I could talk about this more, but, you know, being a child, witnessing my 16-year-old brother be prosecuted as an adult, at 16 years old, being in shackles, being sent to prison, me and my mother going to prison and being disrespected by the prison guards and all but having our faces spat on. Like, that to me was violent. And I think that I grew up learning violence from the state. And so, and this is, just something that I think we need to discuss more. I do believe that violence needs to be understood as happening more as a product of an environment and also as a product of trauma. But I think if we don't talk about it in a racialized context, then we're missing an important point. And I think I just want to say, communities suffering from chaos and destruction. There was some discussion about that too. I grew up in a poor brown community, and I remember there being no CBOs and, very much underserved and over-policed. But I also remember, there being a lot of strength within, the neighborhood, the parents, even fatherless homes having a significant amount of respect for one another. And although maybe the young men were growing up without role models, there was still a significant amount of cohesion. And if anything that I took away from that was the fact that we didn't have fathers because of over-prosecution and policing. Our families were torn apart in, I would say, a violent way because of sentencing. And so I just want to be careful that we don't allow people to believe that Black and brown communities are violent or become violent in a vacuum, but rather they manifest because of the disparate treatment that the state plays a significant role in perpetuating. So I do think that we also need to think about state violence or the state actor as an initiator or an aggressor, not simply inequity as being the root of violence. And so my last point will be, I think that it's also important to think about responses to violence not only as promoting the positive, which I think the papers did an excellent job of talking about restorative justice and trauma-informed practices and community alternatives, but also thinking about refraining from the extremely negative, violent, and destructive forces that government plays in creating and perpetuating violence.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So first, I just wanted to say to Frankie that I think that you put your finger on sort of really what is the pulse beat of all of these issues that we're talking about today. And hopefully we'll talk about it more. I see in our very impromptu setup of when we're allowed to speak that I may be able to talk about it at the end a little bit, but I just wanted to say that the perception of the concentration of violence, of victimization, of the hand of the state, of the effect that has on estranging whole parts of sort of civic society and by itself sort of creating a kind of vicious cycle of being apart. And then on the counter side, the strength of informal networks of families and neighborhoods in being able to do the things that the state tries to do through structures of the criminal justice system is, I think, a huge and untapped mechanism that we do not explicitly call out. So hopefully in my impromptu comments later I can say something, but I just wanted to acknowledge your powerful discussion. And so just sort of picking up from that, okay, so here's a confession. I'm an inveterate reader of self-help books. I'm always trying to improve myself, help myself, be more organized, and so many of these books, The 7 Habits of 25 Effective People, the 343 Frogs You're Supposed to Eat Before Breakfast, et cetera, they say begin with the end in mind. And I actually think, we're New Yorkers almost all, so I can indulge, in New York City at least, we're at this moment where space has been created because of the drops in crime and incarceration and in enforcement to not just imagine, but to do a different way of creating safety and creating justice. And so when I read the papers, I thought to myself, thinking about beginning with the end in mind, and I think in a lot of your recommendations, in both of your papers, you say this, at the end, it's almost like it's looking through the wrong end of the telescope, meaning implicit in the papers are very important questions, like what's the purpose of incarceration? Who belongs in jail? Is a label stigmatizing? How do you separate the person from the, all of those things. But I actually think that we have to pull the camera way back, really to Frankie's point, I think, and to say, how do we stop people from touching the justice system at all? Meaning, all of the things that we're talking about and all the work that absolutely has to take place is really under the sink with a wrench, tinkering with the system itself. How do we make judges not just, be charge-driven? How do we figure out to shorten sentences? All of those things were all cabined within the justice system. But in fact, our goal is to have a fairer justice system, a more efficient justice system, but really what our goal is to live peaceably among one another. And to do that requires us, I think, to unwind the picture a little bit. And we sort of talk in these, labels and cliches of, reinvestment and disinvestment. But really what we're talking about is, what is it in a life course that makes somebody productive and part of the very kinds of family and neighborhood networks that Frankie is talking about? And why is it, that some neighborhoods and groups do well and others do not? And are there ways to sort of understand, what are those investments? Is it Head Start plus mentoring plus summer youth employment? What is that thing, and what are those signals that someone may not, may be falling off that path? But to think about it not as a, how do we rehabilitate? How do we do it? But how do we actually, in an affirmative way, create thriving lives and connections? So just, am I allowed to have one more minute, just because I thought I should actually say something about the paper? So just the other thing, but obviously we live in the system that we live in, and so yes, we should be under the sink with a wrench, and we should be trying to make sure that a justice system actually delivers justice fairly and efficiently. And I guess what really sort of struck me over and over again about the papers is I sort of had a little bit of vertigo, because I thought, at least, that they bounced a little bit from violent offender as a label, and what does that then signal to people who are making decisions, whether it's the parole officer or the prison official. And violent offending as an act, which is actually what the statutes, obviously every state is different, but is trying to, I think, signal. And then it's not just the label versus the act, it's then separately, and does that label or act, is that predictive in any way by itself? And that's, I think, what people have such trouble with, is that, and I think that's sort of the longhand version of what people mean when they say shorthand, the act is not the person, is that thing that you did predictive of what you're going to do in the future? And that's actually a thing we should care about. And I think we make a mistake in, when we look at, and just in the pretrial context, and again, just in New York, when we look across all these labels of misdemeanors, nonviolent felonies, and violent felonies, we find that no matter what the offenses that you've been arrested for, your rate of offending, of committing a violent felony during that pretrial period is the same. So yeah, there is a problem, and yet those acts are being committed. And so what are we trying, are we trying to prevent those things or not? And I guess I would just end by saying, if we don't use words and we don't use risk, and that's worth a whole catered affair such as this, to discuss, then how should judges make determinations? How should programs decide what they're doing? Because there are real harms that are trying to be avoided.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. That was great. I appreciate it. Frankie, I was gonna follow up with you on the notion of violence being contextual versus an individual attribute, but you really kind of got at that, really in your opening stuff. And I don't think a lot of people, this can become a scary-ish conversation if you don't attach it to what the real manifestation of it is in the system we work in. And Liz did a little bit of that, and I'm going to get to you guys on a little bit of that too. But I'm going to go to you first, Frankie, because Californians and the advocates and your group and others that you associate yourselves with have actually done a bunch of stuff, particularly with young adults who have been convicted of or accused of violent offenses. Can you kind of say a little about that and about what you've done so far, and if you were kind of king and could do anything you wanted with this population, maybe within reason? Where do you see this? What have you done so far relative to the young adults that are enmeshed in violence in the justice system, and where do you see this going next?
So just starting off, I think what we've done in terms of outcomes has been to really scale back the harsh treatment of young people who commit serious and violent offenses by removing prosecutors' discretion to have the power to charge kids directly in adult court through direct file. We've abolished life without parole sentences in California. We've provided juveniles age 15 and younger with enhanced constitutional rights by allowing, or rather requiring, that they have attorneys read them the Miranda rights before any custodial interrogation can happen. And we've also instituted youth offender parole laws, as Vinny mentioned earlier, which entitle people who committed their offenses while age 25 and younger to a youth offender parole hearing no later than their 25th year of incarceration. And in that hearing, the parole commissioners must take into account their age, their immaturity, and the hallmarks of youth, and how they've grown since that life crime while in incarceration. And so what we've done is try to, basically force the government and the system's consideration of youthfulness throughout, from arrest and interrogation, through charging and sentencing, and ultimately through parole. And where I'm trying to go with this is completely abolishing the practice of prosecuting and incarcerating kids in the adult system, reducing the reliance on juvenile incarceration and probation for kids that are in the youth system, and dramatically expanding our reliance on community alternatives, whether it's the government or CBOs. But young people must be treated as children. I'll even go further. All kids should be treated as white children. And be given the support that they need in their communities by caring, loving adults in safe environments and with quality services. And the way that we've done that is by empowering the very same people that are labeled violent offenders to speak for themselves. And when I got out, and I mean law school, not jail, which is sometimes the same, in 2012, I was the only formerly incarcerated person, or virtually the only formerly incarcerated person in our movement in California, pushing to abolish life without parole sentences and youth offender parole laws. And once we succeeded, we started to see more and more youthful offenders be released. And now we have, I would say about 1,000 such people in our state, many of them, giving back in tremendous and significant ways to public health and safety, and many of them coming to the Capitol and advocating for these reforms. And I will say, having them speak to their stories and speak to the trauma and the inequity and the destruction that they've experienced and how that fed into their life crime and their poor decisions maybe or mistakes has been, I think, more powerful than anybody in a suit could explain. Even myself, the further I think I am away from being incarcerated, I think maybe a little bit of the edge I lose, but
But you're not wearing a suit.
Yeah, I'm not wearing a suit today.
Let me go to Liz real quick, because that was great. I think that was a good body of stuff. Now, Liz, you're doing a lot of things in New York, and the city is, not just you, but advocates and program providers, judges, prosecutors, to drive the population down. And I'm gonna ask you this question because it's kind of the New York version of what Frankie just said, and then I'd like Jim and Bianca just to kind of respond to the things you've heard Liz and Frankie say. And it's had remarkable results. It's about a third as many people locked up in New York City as were locked up at its peak in the mid-90s. Crime has plummeted during that period of time. Most, but not all of that, is focused on getting lower risk people out of jail. But there's been some things that also reduced the population of people locked up for violent offenses in New York. Can you say a few words about sort of what you've done and now, almost more importantly, as the population declines and it becomes a population in jail that's disproportionately in for more serious offenses and with higher levels of risk, where do you go next? What do you do beyond this? In 2 minutes.
I got this. When the mayor that I worked for came in 5 years ago, we dreamt that someday we would get our population down to 5,000. At the time he came in, it was north of 11,000. And we sort of made up a few things, and we said, hey, what makes a population big? It's the number of people who go in, and it's the length of time that they stay. And we could see our way to about 7,500. And then after that, I sort of punted, and this isn't a written piece of work, and I said, and after that, we have to change people's opinion about violence, meaning New Yorkers have to be willing that people who are charged with violent offenses come back, judges have to be willing to, et cetera. And we have to do something about folks who churn through the system. We really, as Vinny said, with multiple partners, this is not a single, entity, put our shoulder to the wheel to stop the number of people coming in a major way. And as I said, sort of the hand of enforcement lifted significantly, enormous amounts of diversion, huge investments in that, but big culture change among DAs and judges willing to use those things. And the kind of culture change, despite the front page of the New York Post 2 days ago, that actually the judges clamored for increasing the kind of diversion so that it would take young people, 16 to 19 years old, who had been charged with violent offenses, and that's sort of increased a lot. But I think, and so today, we are way ahead of our goal. Our incarceration rate now looks more like the United Kingdom than it looks like the rest of the country. We're probably at a quarter of where it is. At the point at which we get to 4,000, which is what our goal is now, we will look like Norway. So, yay. But I think the question is why. And I think it's like a bunch of things. And I think the most, and sure, it's about, diversion, definitely, that's driven about half of our reduction. It's a little bit about the reduction in enforcement, but obviously not every arrest leads to jail. But the thing that is most interesting and most important and it goes, I think, to the points that everybody has made, New Yorkers' behavior is just changing. So it's not just that, 30 years ago, we committed, 2,200 murders a year, and last year it was a fraction of that. It's that even in the last 5 years, the number of things that are violent acts, robberies, assaults, are just going down. And when you look at who's actually in jail at any particular time, because yes, our judges are very charge-driven, they're influenced by, the scariness of the thing. It's like the biggest dropping population are young adults, are 18 to 21 years old. And the reason why that is so significant, I think, but you guys are actual experts, is that if you're not going to jail young, the likelihood that you're going to come back is going to be low. And so to the extent that like jail begets jail, have we turned the corner into a more virtuous cycle in which the absence of jail, the lightening of the touch of enforcement, is maybe reversing some of the kind of alienation and separation, and that, New Yorkers may be behaving better because maybe the rules make more sense, maybe they're being influenced by, by strong neighborhoods and networks. Is there something else going on?
So I'm going to ask Jim and Bianca to react in a second, but I'd like you guys to start handing out the cards so people can ask questions, or just point to people. Okay? We're pivoting. Jim, I'm going to ask you to react first, and also, beforehand, Liz and you and I were talking about the paper argues against using a violent offender label, particularly at the front end, to predict anything, right? Violence or not violence, reoffending. And there's been a lot of arguments against using risk assessment instruments because there's a sense that they compound racial disparities that have, accumulate through lifetime and cut against people of color. Well, if you're not using risk and you're not using the violent offender label, what are you using to decide whether, if you're a judge, you should detain somebody or not? And what do you do with that? And then I can have you react to all of that. And then
in 2 minutes. Well, let me, a couple of things that Liz and Frankie said. Big picture, crime is way down. Violent crime is extremely rare. The rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 per 100,000. That means 0.3 of 1% of Americans report a violent crime to police each year. It's hard to become a victim of violent crime. The violent crime is down largely for demographic and economic reasons. And that's in a whole other paper, but basically we can see that the number of the fertility rates of women have dropped dramatically. They're not having children. When they have children, they have it at a later age. The size of the household is smaller. And then on the economic side, we're in a good situation with inflation and long-term interest rates, which drive crime rates. It's another paper, but that's the good news. And that's happening everywhere. On the juvenile side, what is interesting, juvenile arrests have dropped 50%. And I think it's tied again to these demographic things, which is tremendous news for the future, because the best predictor of adult criminality is whether he got arrested or not as a juvenile. So we're really in good shape on some of these things. I just want to talk about the victim, and one of the reforms that's not in here that I'm really a strong advocate is reforming victim compensation and how we handle people who have been affected by violent crime and or property crime. And the number one recommendation I have is that victims are compensated fully at the time of sentencing. They don't wait. They get a full payment, whatever happened to them. Because I went through an armed robbery at an early age. I've been assaulted. My house has been burglarized 3 times, and some other things have happened to me. And in all those situations, the criminal justice system didn't care about me at all. And I never could have imagined the person that put the gun in my head, I never thought of sending him to prison. Why would I send him to prison? But that's what the system says. We got to send this guy to prison. But that's not my interest. My interest is to have some kind of relationship here and say, hey, why did you do that? What can we do so you don't do that again? So victim compensation, I think, has to be part of the platform. On risk assessment, I do a lot of this work in corrections. I'll just do it real quick. Pretrial risk assessment should never be used to detain or not detain someone. They're not designed to do that. They should never be used for that purpose. The only purpose they should be used for is setting conditions of supervision or something like that. But because no one who is detained in a jail system, not no one, but the vast majority of people, like 90%, are good risks to be released. So there should always be a presumption of release because they're not a flight risk and they don't pose a danger to society. So that's on the pretrial. On the back end of the system, what I do, and we've implemented in a couple of places, is I call it the college model. When you go to college, you take your SATs, right? And the SATs are supposed to predict, are you a good student? Going to be a good student? It's got a lot of false positives, false negatives. So what we go to then is grades. You go to class. And if you go to class and pass certain things, you get released from college. Same thing in corrections, that you would stop the risk assessment once you do the initial assessment and say, here's what we want you to do. It's pretty straightforward. Don't beat up anyone while you're here, and go to a program that we think will reduce your risk. If you do that, you shall be released, and you shall serve a very short portion of your sentence. That works. We've done this in Maryland. Recidivism rates have dropped. Prison population has dropped. Crime rate has dropped because most people in the correctional systems want to do the right thing. I mean, I worked in these systems. Most of these people are motivated to get out of there as soon as possible by doing the right thing. We just don't build upon that.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Bianca, just a couple things to react to there?
There's so much. First, thank you to Frankie and Liz. Those are really important comments. Frankie, your point about the racialized context is huge. We're co-members of the emerging adult learning community, right? So this is a conversation that has been unfolding and I think is such an important and large point, merits its own detailed brief, right? To really get into the nuance of that discussion. And as Liz was speaking about this, was the quote, I was taking down notes from you all, begin with the end in mind. And I just kept thinking about, we've been going through this really great experiment with juvenile justice, right? And all the things that we've been doing with juveniles and why our rates are plummeting. And we're not seeing this ripple effect where they're coming back into in contact with the criminal justice system, right? So diverting them and getting them resources and things that they need is working much better than looping them in and getting them caught in the web of the criminal justice system. And so, yeah, absolutely. Let's expand on that and let's bring it up, right? So we are hopefully going to be expanding some of those things into emerging adulthood and really, why not the entire system. Other things to comment on. What else? What was the other? Sorry, I was thinking too much about that.
Just for your reaction. So.
All right. The other thing, I guess one final point that I'll make is I think often when we think about emerging adults, right, since that's where I'm focused, we think about their disproportionate criminal justice system involvement, right? Their high rates of violent crime, their high rates of recidivism, their high rates of violent victimization. And I think what is often lost in those discussions is during that same period of time, we see the most rapid decline in movement away from offending. Right? So their frequency in terms of the number of crimes that they're committing is going down fast. The severity and seriousness of the crimes that they're involved in is going down fast. And so if we can focus the lens and maybe shift the script, right, where we emphasize that part of that period of the life course, then maybe there's a way that we can harness that change potential rather than doing things that is disrupting, right, that movement and process away from crime.
So some people hear that,
yeah,
that sort of peak in the age crime curve and think, this sounds like a really good time to incapacitate them. Because if they're going to get better, like why do we let them get better while they're mugging, my neighbor or my loved ones? Like How do you respond to that? I've literally had that argument raised. Like this is not 55-year-olds that we're talking about paroling early. Like Frankie's one of the things Frankie raised was they did some parole work, but the parole work is way after the young people have committed the crime. How do you turn what you've said into an argument for not incarcerating young people? Because some people see it the other way.
And so, one thing to keep in mind is that the point at which you can start to maybe distinguish individuals that might be more serious is the point at which most people are reducing their offending, right? And so if you're having a broad brushstroke where you're incarcerating individuals as a general response to their offending, you are setting them up to be in contexts that we know are criminogenic, right? So they're less likely to experience these major life events that we know are related to and help people stay away from offending. They are separated from their family, right? And so not only for them, this is setting up an intergenerational sort of cleave, right, where they're separated from their children. They're not getting the work and employment experiences that most people during that period of their life course are getting. And so incarceration is doing a really good job at keeping people away from the things that we know are actually going to help them to not be involved in crime.
Jim, and then I'll go to questions after Jim.
Yeah, the issue is that it's our reaction to the event is we've developed this reaction called incarceration, and there's several studies, they go way back to the Utah study, California studies that show take similarly situated people and incarcerate some of them randomly and you get exactly the same result in terms of danger to the public. And the incapacitation effect is so inconsequential, you're not getting anything out of it. So I think we have to look to the science there and says, that tells us you don't have to do this incarceration thing. And the other strong finding we have is that the length of incarceration has no impact on recidivism rate. So whether you do 6 years or 24 months, it's the same result. We've just ramped up our sanctions so much. I mean, my last observation, watching the investigation, the Mueller investigation, it always amazes me that you can go to prison for lying. Usually you just go to your room, but now you can go to prison, for lying to an FBI agent for years. And that just is unbelievable to me that we do that.
Questions? Marsha.
Yeah, just one thing in terms of your question about incapacitating folks to make sure they don't mug, right? The choice doesn't also need to be incapacitation in a prison or nothing, right? And there's research that shows that young people in particular respond to opportunities like mentoring and positive development. So that could be part of your answer. But my question is, sort of looking at the end, how do we get there with respect to the political changes, the legislative changes that are needed, and reflecting back on reforming drug laws, right? Which we're still not there, right? New York may be a little bit better than some others, but we're celebrating this Lane's First Step Act, right? It's like pulling teeth. And a lot of us who had worked on drug law reform actually threw other people defined as violent offenders under the bus. They're not violent. You can be kinder to them. So given how hard it is to get the political system to move on these issues, I know it's not an overnight issue, but it took 30 plus years for even a modicum of drug law reform. Do we want to wait that long or longer dealing with this issue? And so what do you think about that, and what might be good strategies to sort of jumpstart these kind of legislative changes?
Go for it.
Sure. Not as a joke, but I do think we probably need to get rid of Fox News. But last month I had the extreme privilege and honor of visiting Australia I was invited to be a keynote speaker at their Australasian Youth Justice Conference, which involves Australia and New Zealand. And while I was there, I mean, it was daily, multiple times a day, that I got comments about how much of a joke we are to them. And even one of my Lyft drivers said, "The government you have is the government you deserve," which I agree, but I mean, it kind of sounded like fighting words, not to be violent. You know, and I feel like voting is...
Give them 2 stars.
Yeah. I feel like, you know, what they have is compulsory voting. You know, everybody has to vote. And even, you know, it's become so much of their culture that even when they, on the, you know, the special elections where it's not compulsory, they still yield 85% voter turnout. And I feel like, you know, obviously in this country, we don't want people to vote. You know, we do everything we can to not allow people that are most harmed by policies and practices to have a say, you know, and I think we have to, in talking about violence, I keep thinking about, we keep talking about it as a response. Like first something happened and then we are dealing with it improperly, which is just part of the story. But we're not talking about Native American genocide. We're not talking about the reservations and the boarding schools and slavery and convict leasing. These are all initial violent actions that happened that disrupted social fabrics, you know, community and family unity. And so to suggest that somehow people are just behaving badly and we just need to respond better isn't going to get to it. You know, what does it mean to be a 5-year-old kid and see all the signs that you are worthless and you are not to be invested in? You become a teenager, even if you don't commit violent crimes, violence will happen to you. And I think that the powerlessness, you know, there was a comment in I think the Emerging Adult and Violent paper that talked about, you know, violence as a utility. You know, and I think when we don't have wealth, when we don't have political power, violence is the one thing that we do have, and it's so accessible to us. But what will it take to get us to feel like we have power in other means, and not simply feel like if I do vote, it's for the wrong person, you know, and it's going to have no effect. And I do think, you know, going to Liz's point, it does require culture change, but sometimes that means we have to give people another form of power. And wealth, I think, is harder to give, but political power through voting, I think, would yield much, you know, is more doable, maybe not. But I think that is a good place to start, because then we could actually have a say in the world that we are forced to live in.
So one more question, one more response, and I'm going to have you guys do a 1-minute wrap up with what would you do to sort of address the issues that we face today, but it's going to have to be lightning round stuff. So who's got the last question? Okay, lightning round. Who wants to go first?
I'm sitting on the end, so. Oh, I'm sorry, Bianca.
No, I was my hands as well.
So just to begin where I started, I actually think that the way we need to address this issue is it's sort of cabined in much, much bigger issues, and that we're starting to see some tendrils of evidence of how it is that as the hand of the state sort of retreats in New York City, that neighborhood groups and neighborhood ways of dealing with not just violence, but issues of all kinds, dilapidated playgrounds and all kinds of other problem solving are emerging as a kind of organic and durable way that people relate to one another and establish safe neighborhoods and safety for themselves and for their children, which is what we all seek. And so I think that we need to be able to not just find the balance, but to begin to tip towards a world in which government resources, since government has recurring budgets, it should be the arterial structure of reform, and neighborhoods, after all, people are in neighborhoods or who government serves, support these things that structures and relationships and investments that make neighborhoods thrive. And I think that is absolutely the key, that we sort of turn to a more civilianized version of safety. And I think that we are starting to see some evidence of that, and that we should drive a truck through it.
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't want to repeat too much of what I said, but I do think it is kind of a two-track in my mind. One, which is, yes, absolutely promoting the positives, which is the community alternatives, the restorative justice that deals with trauma. Because I know, from the research that I've read, especially around, gang-involved youth and youth who commit serious crimes, and I think it was true in my life that, what we're talking about is young people, even as a transition age youth through 25. I was suffering from low self-esteem, numerous adverse childhood experiences, and a negative self-identity. One that I was trying to be proud of something, and for me, being violent was one thing that I could be proud of. And I think ultimately what saved me after 6 years of incarceration and hundreds of thousands of dollars to make me worse, it was my community that helped me. And as underserved and as chaotic as the outsider might perceive it, that is exactly what I needed. I needed to get out to get better, and it happened in a safe environment where I could drop my guard and where I could feel like I actually absorbed the education, the counseling, and the quality services, and and benefiting from authentic people, the messengers, the counselors, the providers, and we don't do enough empowering of those people. Usually it's people that we consider safe enough to work with those populations that are just inauthentic, inexperienced, and incapable of really dealing with young people in their environment. And two, I think we need to stop, again, this racialized intolerance that we've come to know as the justice system that happens at the front end with community policing and arrests and prosecutions, and the incarceration that happens, the warehousing, we're treated like, McDonald's chickens, tearing out our own beaks, and that's rough because, I remember being in my community and seeing these people, my peers come home from prison, and I just kept thinking, like, the police and the prosecutors don't have to deal with their mistakes. They don't have to deal with their ill-conceived policies. We do. And then they turn around and blame us in our communities and say, look what you've become, and we now can justify what we do to you. And so I really feel like, the state-sponsored violence needs to be mitigated at all costs. So it is both promoting the things that we know work, which is community alternatives, but also restraining the destructive hand of government wherever we see it, and allowing the community to mend and heal itself. It isn't for the government to do. It is for the government to step aside and stop being destructive.
Thanks, Frankie. Bianca?
I think that the theme that I will share today is probably that language matters, right? And that the discourse that we use to talk about people and refer to them matters. And so this idea, right, that individuals who have a violent record or violent act in their past are somehow different than others, right? The data don't support that. These individuals' childhood, adolescent, adult features, right, are similar to their nonviolent peers. We do a terrible job at predicting who is going to be violent, right? Probably because they're just like everyone else. And there's great heterogeneity in this violent offender term, right? From individuals who do physical harm to others, also to those who have a threat, right, against them. And so when you take all of this into account, right, shifting the way we think about these people as worthy of resources, as capable of change and highly likely to change, right? Then I think we need to, or it allows, I guess, pathways and access to the resources that they need to help promote and foster that desistance. And I guess I'll borrow from a colleague of mine, Victor Rios, right, who has argued for this shift in language of rather than thinking about people as at risk, to think about them as at promise. And I think that shifts like that matter. They matter a lot. And so something as simple as language can have really powerful effects in how we talk about people.
Great, thank you. Bianca, Jim, you get the last word.
All right, so I'm remotely optimistic. I think things are going to get better over time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but as the next generation of leadership starts emerging in this country, they're starting to show, you can see them. You begin to see corporations, there's some progressive corporations out there that are funding progressive people, to take the role in government, and that's going to happen. And while that's happening, I think, quite frankly, events like this help. They help plant the seeds. So those people that get into power, until Frankie gets to become governor of California, we'll wait, Frankie. But when you get there, he'll have the plan in place. So it's taken a long time. I would hope in a couple of decades we'd have, if we implemented these policies, our prison population would be half of what it is today. Crime rates would still be going down. And so that's a future I'm looking forward to.
Yep. So thank you very much, folks. The two papers are Thinking About Emerging Adults and Violent Crime that came out of the Emerging Adult Justice Learning Community. And for those of you watching on live stream, that can be found at eajustice.org. And the Square One Project paper, Reconsidering the Violent Offender, can be found at squareonejustice.org, and one is spelled out as a word. I want to thank the really cool live stream folks back there. That is Echoes of Incarceration. Echoes provides filmmaking and advocacy training for youth ages 16 to 22 to explore mass incarceration and its effects on families, and to create documentary films told from the life experiences of the filmmakers themselves. So big round of applause for Echoes. And then I want to thank Liz Glazer, Frankie Guzman, Bianca Bersani, and Jim Austin for their thoughtful comments today. And Anamika for organizing this whole thing, all the other folks that worked on it, and for Bruce, the book award winner today, for kicking us off. Thanks, everybody.